What is that noise?
He's blocking the window. What is he protecting us from?
In the damp mist of an Idaho forest in 1992, a woman laughed out loud, and something ancient answered her. Ada Rollins hadn't laughed in years. A failed marriage, a son who stopped calling, a cabin too quiet for a heart that used to tell jokes at school recess. But one morning, in the forest behind her home, she found a creature, wounded, massive, covered in gray fur. And when she laughed nervously, it responded. Not with a roar, not with violence, but with rhythm, with mimicry, with what sounded like a conversation. They say Bigfoot isn't real, that it's a myth. But what if it's not just real? What if it's listening? Before we dive into this story of fear, healing, and an unexpected friendship, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from right now? And what's your name, dear listener? This story might just travel farther than the deepest woods, maybe even to someone who's also forgotten how to laugh. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you for being here. If you believe in wonder, healing, and the possibility of connection in the most unexpected places, give this video a like, subscribe, and help us build a community where Bigfoot believers and soft hearts belong. The last patch of snow on the north slope was melting into a slow, steady trickle. Water ran like thin silver veins through the muddy path, softening the forest floor into something quiet and yielding. It was the first true thaw of 1992, and the Idaho wilderness was stretching awake, shaking off months of frozen silence. Ada Rollins stood on the porch of her cabin, one hand resting on the cedar frame of the doorway, the other gripping the handle of a chipped enamel mug. Steam rose from her coffee in a way that always felt more symbolic than practical. Warm breath in a cold, indifferent world. Her gray sweater clung to her shoulders, damp at the collar, and her eyes followed the mist drifting across the trees like something she'd once believed in. The cabin sat nestled against a steep slope of Payette National Forest, not far from McCall, but just far enough to disappear. It was the kind of place the world forgot on purpose. No phone, no neighbors, just the hum of wind through pine needles and the occasional grumble of a radio when the signal caught something other than static. She used to laugh here. That part of her lived in a drawer now, buried beneath old-school newsletters and the leftover receipts from a divorce she'd stopped trying to understand. Her son, Matthew, lived in Boise. That was what she told people when they asked. "Matthew's in Boise," as if that explained the long silences and missed birthdays, and how a boy who once begged her to sing in the car now sent Christmas cards signed only with his name. The wind pushed through the pines with a kind of anxious rhythm, as if even the trees were waiting for something. Ada drained the last of her coffee and turned inside. The cabin smelled like wood smoke and drying wool. The old cast-iron stove clicked as it cooled. On the wall above the mantel, a photo of her younger self with laugh lines and a ridiculous red scarf smiled back, holding a boy with missing teeth and eyes too big for his face. She looked away. The rain had started soft, barely a drizzle really, but enough to make the slope behind the cabin slick. She didn't like walking after rain, not this early in the year, but she went anyway. Old habits. A loop around the ridge cleared her head. Let her pretend the air alone was enough to keep things moving. She took the trail slowly, boots pressing deep into the softened ground. Birdsong echoed faintly, not yet confident. Tree trunks stood black with moisture, lichen blooming pale on their sides. Her breath came in little puffs, sharp but steady. She reached the first turn near the ridge, where the trail narrowed along a small drop. A part of the hillside had eroded away over the years, a bite taken out of the path. She stepped carefully. The ground gave just a little. Her heels sank, slid. She caught herself with one hand on a wet pine trunk, muttered something under her breath. It wasn't serious, just enough to remind her how alone she was. Then the sound came, not loud, but wrong. Not an animal sound she recognized. A broken kind of breath, wet and shallow, followed by the crack of a branch. Not distant, not imagined. She turned. At first, she saw nothing. Just the shadows between the trees, the silver shimmer of rain. Then her eyes adjusted. Something was curled against the base of a fir tree about 30 feet down slope. A shape that shouldn't be there. Too big to be a deer. Too still to be a bear. She stepped forward, slow and quiet. The shape twitched. A hand, or something like a hand, jerked upward, catching at the air. She moved closer. It was a creature, covered in coarse gray-brown fur, matted with mud. One leg was twisted beneath it, caught under a length of splintered wood that looked like it had once been part of a trail sign. Its face was turned away, but even from the side, Ada could see the curve of a cheek, the arch of a brow. It was young and terrified. Its breath came in ragged pulses, its chest heaving. One eye caught hers, wide and amber and wet. The moment stretched, then she laughed. She didn't mean to. It wasn't joy. It was panic. The sudden, absurd release of tension so sharp it had nowhere to go. A short, startled laugh. Not even a full sound. Just the kind of thing that slips out when you're halfway between fight and flight. The creature's head snapped toward her. Its expression shifted. Not anger, not fear, but something uncannily alert. It blinked. Then, without warning, it mimicked her, not with a laugh, but with a sound, low and round in its chest. A whoop, followed by a grunt. Then it tapped its fingers, 3 times, against the trunk of the tree beside it. Same rhythm, same spacing, as if the laugh was a code it had just cracked. Ada froze. Her breath caught. Her heart felt suddenly too large for her ribs. She looked down the slope, back at the creature, at its bound leg, at the blood darkening the fur near its shin. Forest Service would never believe her. And if they did, they'd tranquilize it. Study it, cage it. She swallowed hard. Then she said quietly, "I'm not gonna hurt you." Her voice shook, barely above the rain. She didn't know what made her say it out loud. Maybe it was the way the creature's eyes flickered toward her hands. Maybe it was the way it seemed more human than animal. Or maybe it was just something in the silence between them. She stepped carefully toward it, pulling off the scarf around her neck. The creature tensed. She crouched near the leg, fingers trembling, and wrapped the scarf tight around the wound. Not perfect, not sterile, but enough to stop the bleeding. "Okay," she whispered, more to herself than anything. "Okay, okay." When she stood, her knees were damp, her palms smeared with blood and dirt. The rain had thickened now, cold and clean and insistent. She made it back to the cabin first, popped the tailgate open on her old truck, pulled the weather tarp off the back. When she returned, the creature hadn't moved. It had tried. There were drag marks in the mud. But its leg gave out after only a few feet. She didn't speak, just knelt again and nudged the tarp open. The creature stared at her, unmoving. Then, slowly, it crawled forward, each movement deliberate and full of pain. Ada held her breath. When it reached the tarp, it stopped, looked back at her, then climbed in. She wrapped the edges tight, tucked it in like she used to tuck in Matthew when he was sick. The memory stung. She climbed into the driver's seat, heart hammering so hard she couldn't hear the rain. She didn't make it a mile before headlights flared behind her. A sheriff's patrol. She pulled off instinctively, praying the tarp didn't shift. Her mirrors caught the shape of the truck creeping past. Windows fogged, slow and suspicious. She counted the seconds in her head. When they didn't stop, her grip on the wheel loosened just enough to breathe. In the rearview mirror, she caught sight of the creature's eyes, watching her through the slit in the tarp. There was no fear in them now, only waiting. She whispered, almost without sound, "What am I doing?" But she already knew. She was breaking the rules, all of them. And for the first time in years, her chest ached not from silence, but from something dangerous, something warm, something like purpose. Rain hit the windshield like 1,000 tiny promises. The wipers moved too slow. The trees passed by like quiet sentinels, and somewhere behind her, wrapped in tarp and mystery, a creature tapped 3 slow beats against the metal bed of the truck, like punctuation, or thanks, or maybe just the start of a conversation. The storm passed sometime before dawn, leaving behind a forest rinsed clean and glistening like wet stone. Fog clung to the tree trunks, thin and restless, the kind that never truly settles. Ada sat at the kitchen table, hands curled around a mug of tea gone cold, her eyes drifting toward the back of the cabin where the storage room door was shut, but not locked. She hadn't locked it since the night she brought him in. She hadn't told herself what she was doing yet. There hadn't been time for names or explanations. She just knew she didn't want it, or him, out there, not bleeding, not alone. She heard movement again, gentle, almost respectful. The soft shuffle of feet against old floorboards, the creak of weight shifting somewhere near the far wall. Not once had he broken anything. Not the spare chair, not the shelves, not the cracked radio she'd left on a stool in the corner. Everything he touched like it might remember. When she stepped into the room that morning, he was perched low beside the wood pile, eyes half-lidded, following her without fear. His bandaged leg was swollen but not bleeding. In the weak morning light, his fur looked more copper than brown, streaked with silver at the temples and darker around the hands. His shoulders rose and fell in a rhythm she recognized from old dogs, guarded but not unfriendly. She didn't speak. She brought food. Apples, boiled eggs, half a sandwich she hadn't finished the night before. Set them down on a shallow tin tray and backed away. He didn't lunge or growl, just sniffed, ate quietly, then sat still like he was waiting for something else. Ada watched from the door frame. When he raised one hand and pressed his palm flat to the wooden floor, she realized he was mimicking her again. The way she'd rested her hand on the table last night. The way she'd held herself when she didn't think he could see. He wasn't just watching her. He was studying her. Later, when the sun had climbed and the day stretched out dull and gray, she lit the stove and played a VHS tape. She hadn't touched them in years. The plastic box was labeled in her own handwriting. Matthew 3rd grade talent show. The image fuzzed and rolled before it settled. There he was, little and lanky, hair slicked to one side, stumbling over the cord to the microphone stand. Her laugh came out before she could stop it. A real laugh, messy and sharp, echoing too loud in the small kitchen. She covered her mouth too late. Her shoulders shook. A crash followed from the back room. Then the door flew open. He was there. Bracken. She'd started to think of him as that, bracken, like the plant. Something wild, but rooted. He stood upright in the doorway, not hunched or crouching, but tall and bristling. His chest puffed, his eyes locked onto hers, and he slammed his palm, once, twice, 3 times, against the frame. Not violent, not angry. Deliberate. She stared, heart pounding. He grunted something low and rhythmic. Then again, faster, matching the pattern of her laugh. 3 beats, then 2, then a lingering hum. His expression changed with each sound, tilting his head, narrowing his eyes, flaring his nostrils. It wasn't random. He was responding. She laughed again, this time unsure, and he answered immediately, louder, arms flexing, feet shifting wide like he was bracing for argument. It felt like a challenge, but not the kind you run from. He dropped down into a crouch across from her, legs folded under him, elbows on his knees. His fingers drummed against the floor in sets of 3. His eyes never left hers. "You don't like laughing?" she asked, voice softer now. He cocked his head. Repeated a short, clipped whoop, then a grunt, then the drumming again. When she didn't respond, he stood, walked slowly past her, and stood between her and the TV. The screen played on, Matthew reciting something from memory, nervous and small, the audio crackling. Bracken stared at it. then tapped the side of the screen with his knuckles 3 times, then 4, then silence. Ada turned the volume down. He relaxed. She turned it up again. His shoulders tensed. She shut it off completely. He exhaled through his nose, deep and slow, and sat down beside the couch. Like a sentinel, she stood there, uncertain, her hand still on the TV dial. She'd assumed the sound had upset him, that maybe laughter triggered some old threat response. But now, watching him, she wasn't so sure. He hadn't been afraid. He'd been engaged. She tested the theory later, when the cabin was quiet and the sky had turned a dull pewter. Sitting at her bedroom desk, flipping through old-school yearbooks, she chuckled at a photo she hadn't seen in ages. Herself, in an ugly Christmas sweater, holding a pie that had fallen apart in the oven. She barely made a sound. But from the back room, she heard it. 3 steady knocks, not urgent, not hostile, just aware. She stood, walked to the hallway, and peered around the corner. The door to the storage room was closed again, but something told her he was on the other side, waiting, listening, keeping count. She sat on the floor outside the door and laughed again, softly this time, then paused. Silence. She tapped her fingers against her knee. Knocks answered her. 3, then 1. Then silence again. She didn't understand the language yet, but it was a language. That night, she dreamed of rhythm, of wind chimes and woodpeckers and the way Matthew used to tap his spoon on the edge of his cereal bowl when he was thinking. When morning came, Bracken stood at the window. His breath fogged the glass in slow exhales. His posture was calm but alert, like he was watching for something. Ada joined him. The woods were still, the rain gone. Steam rose off the trees in lazy spirals. Nothing moved, but Bracken's gaze was locked, distant, focused. She turned on the radio. Old folk station, weak signal, and began to hum along to the melody out of habit. As soon as she did, he turned to her. He pressed his hand to his chest, then made a low, humming sound from deep in his throat. Matched her tone, matched her rhythm, then corrected it slightly, shortened a note, adjusted the pitch. She followed. A conversation without words. She hummed again, changing the beat. He narrowed his eyes, then knocked the floor beside him, correcting her again. She laughed out loud. "You're teaching me." He blinked, sat down. That afternoon, she opened her old notebook and began to write down what she remembered. 3 knocks for acknowledgement, 4 for correction, a whoop for question, a grunt for disapproval, maybe. A language built in pattern. In. Sound. As she wrote, he watched. Not intrusively, just present. She played another tape that night. This time, a comedy special she'd used to love. Taped off a PBS station years ago, back when she and her ex-husband still spoke in full sentences. The comedian's voice was high and fast, the jokes sharp and old-fashioned. She smiled but didn't laugh. Bracken watched from the hallway, eyes narrowed, fingers twitching. When the laugh track kicked in, he shifted, sat down, crossed his arms. She turned down the volume. He nodded. She turned it back up. He stood. She turned it off. He settled again. It wasn't the sound he disliked. It was the tone, the forced nature, the artificial laughter. It wasn't real. Ada looked at the TV, then at him. He didn't hate laughter. He hated what wasn't true. That night, she fell asleep on the couch. Bracken curled up beside the door. Before the light faded completely, she thought she heard him hum. Low, warm, not quite a tune, but close. She didn't dream. In the morning, she laughed once, quietly, while heating water. The spoon had slipped into the kettle and clanged like a bell. The sound startled her. She chuckled. From the back room, 3 gentle knocks. He was still listening, still watching, still answering, and somehow, that mattered more than anything. The kettle had just begun to whisper when tires crunched onto the gravel path. Ada froze mid-step, dish towel still slung over one shoulder. She hadn't told anyone to come. She hadn't told anyone anything in weeks. For a second, Her mind raced to the storage room door. Bracken was in there, sitting low and silent like he always did when the world stirred outside their little cocoon. She moved to the window, pushed the curtain back an inch. A red Subaru pulled in behind her truck, headlights flicking off. The driver's side door opened and Megan stepped out, wrapped in a green fleece jacket, holding a paper sack in one hand and a grin on her face like she had every right to be there. Ada exhaled, just a little. Of course. Megan. She walked out to the porch, the breeze cold and crisp, carrying that piney bite of lingering snowmelt. You gonna pretend you didn't hear the phone ring, or are you just surprised I found the place again? Megan called out as she climbed the short steps, laughter already warming her voice. Ada managed a half smile. Phone hasn't worked in a month. You're lucky I still like you. Megan held up the sack. Then you'll love me. Lemon pound cake. Real lemons, not that bottled garbage you used to buy. Don't start, Ada warned. But her smile reached her eyes now. It was strange, letting someone in. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, like its secrets had grown into the corners and would show themselves without warning. They sat at the kitchen table, tea steeping in mismatched mugs, the cake sliced and already half-eaten. The kind of conversation that only came from shared memory and old pain filled the air. Soft, winding, easy to fall back into. Megan had been the only person from Ada's old life who hadn't tried to fix her. She just showed up sometimes, stayed just long enough to remind Ada who she used to be. So, Megan said, sipping her tea. When's the last time this place heard laughter? Ada paused. 2 days ago, she said, eyes flicking toward the storage room. Megan raised an eyebrow. You? Laughing? I know, Ada muttered. It surprised me too. But before Megan could press her, something clattered in the back room. Ada stiffened. Megan's head turned. What was that? Ada stood quickly. Just, probably the broom fell. The doorknob turned. The door opened. He stood there. Bracken, taller in the doorway than he had any right to be. Shoulders brushing the frame, eyes wide, not afraid, alert. Megan's cup hit the floor and shattered. Ada's hand shot out. Don't move! Bracken didn't growl. He didn't bare teeth or bristle. Instead, he stepped into the room with slow, careful movements and approached the table. Megan backed against the wall, breath stuck somewhere between her lungs and her throat. Bracken stopped at the edge of the table, dropped into a crouch, and placed both hands flat against the wood. His gaze darted between them, then locked onto Megan. He tapped the table. Once, twice, then began a rhythm. Whoop, grunt, tap, tap, tap. It mirrored Megan's startled gasp. 3 beats. Perfect mimicry. Ada's voice was quiet. He's been doing that. Megan didn't answer. She was staring like her brain couldn't quite shape what she was seeing. Bracken shifted, tilted his head, and knocked again. Then he made a sound. A low, drawn-out whoop that seemed to ask something. Ada stepped forward. She's okay, she said softly. You don't need to. Before she could finish, Bracken straightened suddenly and turned toward the window. His entire posture changed. One arm raised slightly, shoulders broadening, stance defensive. He placed himself between the women and the window as if he'd done it 100 times. Ada moved to look. Beyond the glass, something glinted in the dirt near the tree line. She pushed the door open and walked to the edge of the porch. The forest stood still, windless, but something felt off. She scanned the clearing. The soft ground at the perimeter of the trees bore a heavy boot print. Not hers, not Megan's. And next to it, half buried in pine needles, a crumpled beer can. She moved slowly toward it, heart beginning to hammer. Beside the can, tucked under a cluster of dead leaves, was the end of a small animal bone, gnawed and discarded. Ada crouched and ran her fingers along the soil. Not Bracken. She turned back toward the cabin. He was warning us, she said. Megan had followed her out now, arms wrapped tight around herself. Ada, she whispered. Someone's been out here. Yeah, Ada said. And he knew it. Bracken remained in the doorway, eyes locked on the trees. Inside, the air had changed. Not tense exactly, but charged. Megan glanced back at him, still unsure, still reeling. But something in her expression had shifted. "He's not trying to scare us," she said quietly. Ada met her gaze. "He's protecting us." Bracken made no sound, but he blinked slowly, as if in agreement. The rest of the afternoon passed like a held breath. Bracken didn't retreat to the storage room. He stayed close to the windows, eyes flicking to every sound. Chipmunks, breeze, snapping twigs. He was calmer once night fell. He let himself relax only after Ada pulled the curtains shut and turned on the lamp in the living room. He sat near the hearth, legs folded, back straight, eyes half-lidded. Megan watched him from the corner of the couch. Ada brewed another pot of tea and cut more cake, placing a small plate on the floor near Bracken, who sniffed it, didn't eat, but gave her a soft hum of recognition. "What's he doing now?" Megan asked in a low voice. "Listening," Ada replied. "Always listening." She glanced at him again. He hadn't made a sound in over an hour. But every time one of them laughed, even lightly, he lifted his chin, perked his ears, tilted his head, like laughter had its own shape in the air and he could trace it. "Is he hurt?" Megan asked, more softly this time. "Was," Ada said. "I think he's healing." "And you've been hiding him out here like it's nothing." Ada didn't answer right away. The kettle hissed behind her. Then she said, "He was alone, bleeding, like something had chased him. He didn't run at me. He didn't growl. He looked at me like I was the one that needed saving." Megan looked down at her hands. "You're in trouble if anyone finds out." "I know, but you don't regret it." Ada shook her head. "Not for a second." Later that night, Megan pulled her coat tighter and stepped out onto the porch, eyes scanning the darkness. "You sure you'll be all right out here?" Ada leaned in the doorway, arms crossed. "I've got company." Megan looked at her. "He's not what we thought, is he?" "No," Ada said. "He's not." Before Megan could step off the porch, Bracken appeared behind the screen door. Megan startled, then stopped. They stared at each other again. He didn't grunt or knock this time. He just stood there, watching, like a guard, or maybe a host. "Tell him," Megan whispered. "Thank you." Ada nodded. Megan climbed into her car. The engine rumbled to life. As her headlights disappeared down the road, Ada turned to see Bracken had walked to the far end of the porch. He sat facing the woods now, completely still, his back to the house, like a silent gatekeeper. The stars had begun to show through the clouds. Somewhere deep in the forest, an owl called. The wind picked up just slightly, brushing across Ada's face as she stepped inside and closed the door gently behind her. And from the porch, Bracken never moved. The first cassette clicked softly inside the recorder. Ada leaned over the counter, index finger hovering above the rewind button, not quite ready to play it back. She could still hear the rhythm in her head, the echo of her own laugh. Then his response. That strange blend of knock and growl and something not unlike music. It hadn't stopped haunting her since the moment she realized he wasn't mocking the sound. He was echoing it, measuring it, matching it. Outside, the clouds hung low and motionless, casting a dim, pewter sheen over the cabin. Bracken hadn't stirred since dawn. He sat by the kitchen window, gazing at nothing in particular, his long fingers absently tracing the grains in the old wood table. He was always listening, but today he seemed quieter, more inward, as if even he sensed the question building inside her. She pressed play. Her own voice played back first. A laugh, stiff and surprised. Then another, freer. Then a third, deeper now, relaxed. Immediately afterward came his voice. First a grunt, then a rapid whoop, then 3 quick taps on what must have been the wall behind him. Then silence. The hairs on her arms lifted. She fast-forwarded. Another section, another laugh, this one muffled, like she was trying not to let it out. And again, his reply. Softer, shorter, like he was mirroring not just the rhythm, but the volume, the tone, the mood. She pulled the tape out, labeled it in blocky ink. Sample A. Night 3. Short response. By noon, she had 3 full tapes. Each one had patterns, shifts in pitch, duration, a rhythm that wasn't accidental. She needed someone who understood that. She needed Halden. It had been years since she'd seen him. They weren't close, not really. But Halden Pierce had once taught an evening biology course at the local community college. Field ecology, forest acoustics, and species behavior. He'd been awkward and brilliant. The type who never looked anyone in the eye for more than a second, but could tell a coyote from a fox just by the rustle they made in snow. She called from the payphone outside the small grocery store 2 towns over. Halden's voice crackled on the line. "Ada Rollins? That really you?" She hesitated. "I need to show you something." The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to make her second-guess the decision. "I'm retired now," he finally said. "Don't do research anymore." "You don't need to write anything up," she said. "I just need you to listen to something, that's all." Another pause, then, "Bring it over." Halden's place was up a winding hill near Riggins, tucked behind a row of firs that looked like they'd grown there just to hide him. He opened the door wearing an old sweater full of burrs and socks that didn't match. His beard had turned completely gray since she'd seen him last. She sat at his cluttered kitchen table and slid the cassettes across without a word. He raised an eyebrow. "You bringing me ghost stories?" "Just play the first one," she said. "Tell me if it's a bobcat, or a bird, or something else." Halden pushed his glasses up his nose, slid the cassette into a dusty player, and pressed play. The first few seconds passed without reaction. Her laugh played back. Then Bracken's sounds. The room seemed to hold its breath. Halden tilted his head, rewound, played it again, then again. He stopped the tape. "What is this?" "I don't know," she said quietly. "I mean, I do, but I don't." He looked at her, really looked at her, the way someone does when they know something real just brushed the edge of their world. He played the second tape, then the third, each time his brow furrowed deeper, his fingers curling tighter around the mug in his hands. "It's not mimicry," he said finally. "Not in the way birds do it. And it's not a threat response either. There's emotional modulation here. You hear it, don't you? In the timing, the tonal variation. This is responsive." Ada nodded. "He only does it when I laugh." Halden blinked. "You've seen this creature?" "Yes." He didn't ask what it looked like, or how big, or if she was joking. He just leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling like he was rearranging the stars in his head. "The whoops," he muttered. "They're consistent, but not identical. It's not parroting, it's conversation, layered acoustic bonding. Primates do this. Whales, crows in rare cases." Ada leaned in. "What kind of bonding?" "Social, familial, comfort-seeking. It's often seen between parent and offspring or between long-bonded pairs. It's adaptive, language-like, but rooted in emotion." She looked down at her hands. "So he's not fighting my laugh?" Halden shook his head. "No, he's answering it." The silence that followed pressed hard into her chest. She hadn't realized how much she needed that sentence until she heard it said aloud. Then Halden's tone changed. Whatever this is, Ada, it's unprecedented. If this is a new primate species—" "No," she interrupted sharply. "Stop right there." He frowned. "You understand what this could mean for science?" "I do, and I don't care." He stood, pacing now. "This could be recognition-level work, discovery, maybe even protected status, with the right documentation." "And then what?" she said, voice rising. "They'll come with cages and nets and rifles with tranquilizers. And if he runs, or if he doesn't understand, they'll shoot him." Halden froze. She took a breath, steadier this time. "I didn't come here for a lab. I came here because I needed someone to tell me I'm not crazy, someone to help me understand what he's trying to say." Halden sat again. After a long pause, he said, "Then you can't let anyone else hear these." "I won't." He rubbed his temples. "Does he make any other sounds?" Ada thought back. "He hums. Sometimes. Mostly when he's calm. Or when I do first. Halden nodded. He's matching your cadence. That's intimacy behavior. Trust. It's not just that he recognizes you. He sees you as kin. She swallowed hard. I think I feel the same. When she got home, dusk was sinking fast, low and cold. The sky had turned to slate, and the trees stood still like they were listening too. Bracken was already waiting at the window. She stepped inside, set the tapes down gently, and went straight to the old tape player near the hearth. She slid in the first cassette. Pressed play. Her laughter filled the room again. Then his voice. Then hers again. She sat on the floor, facing the recorder, legs tucked under her. Bracken padded quietly across the room and lowered himself beside her. She didn't look at him. Not yet. She just let the tape keep rolling. One laugh, one reply, one shared rhythm, and then it hit her. The loneliness of it. How long he might have been waiting in those woods, mimicking birdsong and coyote howls and rustling leaves, hoping one day something would answer back. She felt the tears rise before she could stop them. Not out of fear, not even sadness, just the sheer, overwhelming relief of being understood. When the tape ended, the room went still again. She turned to Bracken. "You weren't fighting it," she whispered. "You were answering me." He didn't knock, or whoop, or grunt. He just placed one hand lightly on the floor between them, palm up, open. She placed her hand in his. Not quite the same size, not quite the same shape, but in that moment, they fit. Outside, the wind stirred again, carrying with it the faintest sound from the tree line. It wasn't a bird, or an echo. It was a call, and it was coming from the forest. There was something almost reverent in the way he tapped the rhythm now. Not just mimicry anymore, something deeper. A dialogue, slow and patient. The way snowmelt finds the same path every spring. It started that morning with a hum. Ada had been stirring oatmeal by the stove, letting the spoon circle the pot without thought, humming an old tune from her childhood, the kind of thing her mother used to sing while folding towels. Nothing she meant to share, just a sound that slipped out between thoughts. And Bracken, seated nearby on the woven mat she'd laid out for him, had joined her. Not loud, not perfect, but in pitch, in step, in something more honest than imitation. She stopped humming and turned, surprised. He kept going. And when she began again, this time deliberately, he corrected her rhythm with a light knock against the wall, just a half-beat sooner. Like a teacher. Ada laughed. "You're bossy," she said under her breath. He blinked slowly, then offered a hum of his own, rounder, deeper, rising at the end. She hummed it back. It became a kind of lesson between them. Every sound she made, he adjusted. Not just pitch, but breath, cadence, the placement of her hands. When she tapped the wooden counter, he raised his brows and corrected her tempo. When she tried again, slower this time, he nodded, eyes softening. She didn't know what they were building together. A song? A code? A bridge? That night, by lamplight, he reached across the table and, with one large hand, gently touched the center of her chest. She froze. His fingers stayed just long enough to feel the vibration of her voice, then pulled away. She understood. He was teaching her where the sound begins, not in the throat, not the mouth, but the breath behind the bones, the hum of being alive. For 3 days, they practiced like that. She started keeping notes. Symbols, dashes for beats, arrows for pitch, a new language growing in the margins of an old grocery list. She didn't show the pages to anyone, not even Megan, not Halden. This wasn't for study. It was communion. But not everything stayed inside their quiet world. She was in town for supplies when she heard the voices. At the hardware store near the fishing gear. 2 men, both in their 50s, with that worn-in look that came from years of windburn and campfire smoke. She didn't catch their names, just the way one of them leaned closer to the other and said, "I swear to God, man, it wasn't a coyote. I know what coyotes sound like. This was deep. It echoed, like a moan, but bigger." By the old forestry road. Yep, near that cabin. What's her name used to live up there, the school lady. Ada's stomach twisted. You said anything? Yeah. Steel trap by the creek bend, just in case it circles back. Ada didn't finish shopping. She left her cart, walked straight to her truck, and sat with the engine off, heart pounding behind her ribs. She knew that creek. She'd crossed it 3 days ago with Bracken. She remembered the way he paused there, sniffed the air like something in the earth was familiar. She'd thought maybe he'd been born nearby. That night, she didn't sleep. At dawn, she packed wire cutters and antiseptic into her old satchel, slipped a pair of thick gloves into the pocket, and stepped out into the waking forest. Bracken joined her, silent as fog. He didn't ask where they were going, just followed. Maybe he already knew. The air grew colder the closer they got to the creek. Water ran louder than usual, snow melt carving new veins through stone. Birds kept quiet. The world had that hush it wore before storms or something worse. She spotted the trap before he did. It sat half buried under a light scatter of pine needles, teeth open wide like a grin. Her breath hitched. Bracken snarled low, a different kind of sound than she'd ever heard from him. It wasn't directed at her. It vibrated through the ground. He kicked dirt over the trap once, twice, then crouched and began to pat more earth atop it, covering the metal. The sound he made while doing it, it wasn't angry. It was tired. Ada stepped forward, careful not to get too close, and used the cutters to disable the spring. It resisted at first, then gave. She wrapped the trap in an old feed sack and tied it shut. As she stood, something scratched her wrist, metal from the edge of the trap, a shallow cut. Still, it bled fast. She winced. Bracken saw. He reached out with both hands, gentle, alert. She let him take her wrist. He pulled her sleeve back, leaned in, and did something she didn't expect. He hummed, not like before. This time the sound was aimed, directed toward the wound, a sound that vibrated gently across her skin. Not loud, not magic, just intention. She felt her breath catch, not from pain, from something else. She whispered, "Thank you." They walked back without speaking. When they reached the ridge behind her cabin, he stopped, stared up the slope. Ada followed his gaze. There, halfway up the hill, half shrouded by a cluster of trees, stood a figure, taller than Bracken, broader, older. Its fur was darker, more matte, and streaked with what looked like ash or snow. Its arms hung low, but its chest rose with slow, even breaths. It didn't move, didn't approach. Bracken stepped forward. The figure made a sound. Not a whoop, not a growl. Something older, something layered with gravity. A vocalization from a deeper well. Bracken answered. Not with the rhythm he used with Ada. A different pattern. Slower, like a child speaking to an elder. They stood like that for almost a minute. Then the figure nodded, just once, and melted back into the trees. Ada stood frozen, her hand still bleeding a little beneath the bandage she'd wrapped, her heart louder than her thoughts. She turned to Bracken. His eyes were damp. He made a sound then, a new one she hadn't heard before. It was softer. A kind of farewell. She swallowed. You know them. He didn't reply. Just walked back toward the cabin without looking behind. That night, Ada dreamed of circles, of calls and replies, of symbols drawn in the air. She woke with a whisper on her lips. Do you miss home? The knock came just after noon. Not sharp, not tentative. That kind of middle ground knock that said, I'm not sure if I belong here, but I came anyway. Ada wiped her hands on the dish towel, heart catching in her throat before she even reached the door. No one had knocked in months, not without calling first, not with that rhythm. She opened it slowly. Matthew stood there, taller than she remembered. Leaner too, with a beard that hadn't been trimmed in weeks and a duffel slung over one shoulder. He wore a windbreaker that looked too thin for the season and squinted into the doorway like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Hey, Ma. She stared at him for a second longer than she meant to, then stepped aside without a word. He walked in slowly, ducking his head like the ceiling might have lowered since his last visit. The cabin smelled like firewood and lemon balm and something else he couldn't place. Lived in, maybe. Warmer than it should have been. "You haven't changed much," he said, setting the duffel near the couch. "This place still feels like 1994. Ada crossed her arms. "You didn't call." Matthew scratched the back of his neck. "Yeah, I know. I was already on the road when I thought about it." She gave a small nod, lips pressed into a line. There were questions she wanted to ask. None of them felt safe yet. He walked into the kitchen, peering around like he was trying to spot the ghost of his younger self, hiding in the corners. "So what have you been doing out here all this time?" "Living." He smiled faintly. "You still drink that disgusting nettle tea?" Ada turned to the kettle. "Every morning." He leaned against the counter. "You always said this cabin was too lonely to stay in for more than a few weeks at a time." "It's not lonely," she said quietly. He tilted his head, caught the change in her voice, and studied her face. "Okay," he said slowly. "So what's different now?" A thud echoed from the back hallway. Matthew's brow creased. "You got a roommate?" Ada moved quickly to the hall, blocking his view. "Just the wind." He didn't believe her. He stepped past her before she could stop him. Bracken was already standing at the far end of the hallway. Full height, unhidden. Matthew froze. His breath caught like it had slammed into glass. "What the hell?" Ada stepped between them, arms out. "Don't." Matthew took a step back, eyes wide. "What is that?" "He's not dangerous." "That's not a he. That's Jesus, Mom. It's a bear or something." Bracken didn't move. He stood perfectly still, eyes locked on Ada's face, hands low and open. No sound, no challenge. Matthew glanced at the coat rack, grabbed the small shovel leaning beside it. "Put that down," Ada said. "I'm not gonna let this thing—" "I said put it down." Her voice cracked like something ancient. Matthew stopped. Bracken remained frozen, but his gaze shifted. First to the shovel, then to Ada's face, then back again. Matthew's knuckles whitened around the handle. Then he did something Ada hadn't expected. He laughed. Low, sharp, mocking. "This is insane. You're living with Bigfoot? You're teaching it manners?" He stepped forward, still holding the shovel, now gesturing with it like it was punctuation. "Does it fetch your slippers too? Rub your back at night?" Bracken's breath deepened. Not fast, not panicked, just focused. Ada's hand reached toward Matthew. "Stop talking like that." But Matthew had already launched into a ridiculous impression, gurgling and knocking his knuckles against the wall in fake rhythm. "She's turned feral, huh? Laughs and knocks, knocks and laughs. What does it do when you snore, record it and hum back?" Bracken took one step forward, then raised his hands. Not fists, not claws. Just lifted them halfway, palms facing downward. He made a sound. Not a growl, not a whoop. A deep pulsing hum. It vibrated through the floor. A warning, but not an attack. Something ancient, something protective. Ada's chest tightened. "Matthew," she whispered. "He's trying to stop you." Matthew looked between them, suddenly unsure. He lowered the shovel slightly. Then Bracken stepped between him and the door, raised one hand, tapped the frame 3 times, sharp, precise. Then 2 more, off rhythm, urgent. Ada stepped forward. "What does that mean?" Bracken stared straight at her, then looked past her to the front of the cabin, then back again. He tapped twice more. Ada turned. The cabin creaked, and then it came. The sound was soft at first, like a sigh. But then the earth moved, the hillside. It wasn't a sound, it was motion. The entire slope behind the cabin gave way with a groan so deep it felt like a throat clearing beneath the forest. The rain from last week, the erosion near the ridge, the soft dirt. Everything collapsed in a slow, monstrous slide. Matthew had been heading toward the porch. One more step and he would have been standing exactly where the earth vanished. The ground took half the gravel driveway, the left tire of the truck, and a good chunk of the slope down to the creek. Silence fell like a lid. Bracken stepped back, slowly, hand still lifted. Matthew stood frozen. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Ada grabbed his arm. "You saw that," she said, breath shaking. He knew. Matthew sat down hard on the floor like his legs had given out. His hands were trembling. I was about to step out there. I know. I would have. He looked at Bracken again. His voice cracked. He saved me. Bracken made a sound, soft, low. A single note, a reassurance. Ada knelt beside her son, brushing his sleeve with trembling fingers. He's not a monster. Matthew didn't answer. His eyes were still fixed on Bracken. They stayed that way for a long moment. 3 beings in the same cabin, no longer strangers, no longer completely separate from each other. Later that night, Matthew sat by the hearth with a blanket across his shoulders. Bracken was across from him, head tilted slightly, watching but relaxed. Matthew broke the silence first. I made fun of your laugh. Ada looked at him. I noticed. I didn't know it meant something. She poured more tea. Most people don't. He nodded, then looked at Bracken again. I'm sorry. Bracken didn't speak, but he hummed. A soft, low note that hung in the room like forgiveness. Matthew leaned back, his head against the chair. Is he going to leave? Ada didn't answer right away. She looked at Bracken. He was staring out the window, toward the darkened ridge, where the earth had shifted, and the trees now leaned differently. His eyes blinked slowly. His hand tapped once against the wooden floor, then again, and then he went quiet. The next morning brought the kind of light that lingered low across the trees, stretching itself thin and golden over the broken edge of the slope behind the cabin. Mist curled over the scarred hillside where the earth had collapsed days before, like it was trying to cover the wound. Ada stood at the edge of it with her arms wrapped around herself, the coffee in her mug already cold. She hadn't spoken much since the slide. Words felt brittle now, unnecessary. Everything that needed saying was already echoing in her chest. Matthew had been quieter too. Not the defensive quiet she'd grown used to over the years, but something softer, thoughtful. He moved around the cabin like someone seeing with new eyes, helping without being asked, fixing the sag in the front porch step, reinforcing the slope with logs and river stones like a man who wanted to earn his place again. He didn't mention leaving. Didn't mention his job in Boise, his apartment, his girlfriend, as if those pieces of his life had lost weight somehow, as if none of them had been the thing pulling at him all along. Bracken stayed close but watchful. He didn't hum as often now, didn't tap unless invited. He spent more time outside, always near the tree line, always listening, as if waiting for a voice to return. That afternoon, Ada found herself back in the rocking chair by the wood stove, the same one she'd sat in for years without noticing the way the grain on the armrest curved like a river. Matthew sat on the floor beside her, back against the wall, flipping through an old photo album she'd thought she'd thrown out years ago. You remember this? He asked, holding up a photo of them at the lake, both sunburnt and smiling, his hair a tangle of cowlicks. I remember the mosquitoes, she said. He laughed, a real one this time. Bracken stirred by the hearth. His head rose. Matthew glanced over and grinned. Uh-oh. He's gonna argue with me again. Ada smiled. Not if you get the rhythm right. Matthew tapped his fingers on his knee. 3 beats. Pause. 2. Bracken tilted his head, waited, then responded with a single low whoop. That good or bad? Matthew asked. Sounds like approval. They both laughed then, and Bracken sat up straighter. His body language changed, shoulders lifted, posture open, as if some signal had been received. And then something answered. Not from inside the cabin, not from the clearing, from the ridge. It came like the echo of wind, but it wasn't wind. A distant whoop, then another lower, then silence. Bracken stood slowly. His eyes met Ada's. Is that them? She asked, barely breathing. He didn't answer with a sound. He walked to the door and pressed his palm against it. Not opening it, just touching. Outside, the woods held their breath. That night after dinner, Ada lit a few extra lanterns. Something about the dark felt thicker than usual, like a veil had dropped over the mountain. Bracken paced along the windows, not anxious, ready. He stopped only when the fire crackled. Matthew watched him. "Do you think they'll come here?" Ada didn't reply. She was still staring at the old wood carving that hung above the door, one her father had made. 2 wolves curled nose to tail in a circle. A family. A bond. Bracken turned then and let out a low, sweeping hum. Not the kind he used with Ada. It was older, broader in tone. The sound rolled into the beams of the ceiling, and the forest answered. 3 whoops, 1 long note, then footsteps. Heavy, slow, crunching pine needles. Matthew stood, heart thudding. Ada reached for Bracken's arm. He moved to the front door and opened it. Just enough. Outside, at the edge of the clearing, shapes emerged. Not 1, 3. The tallest stood to the right. Gray-furred, wide-chested, eyes sharp with age. Beside it, a smaller figure, limbs long and delicate. And behind them, half hidden in shadow, a third. Young, curious, watching. Bracken stepped onto the porch. He didn't look back. Ada and Matthew followed, but stopped at the threshold. The night air was cold and smelled of moss and something older, something wild and earthy and alive. The tallest Bigfoot stepped forward, then made a sound, long, guttural, steady. Bracken answered, knocking the wooden railing with his knuckles, then placed a hand on his own chest. The older creature did the same. The second stepped forward and mirrored the movement. Matthew whispered, Are they greeting him? They're accepting him, Ada murmured. Bracken turned to face them one last time. He looked at Ada, then Matthew, then tapped 3 slow beats on the porch floor. Ada replied without thinking. Same rhythm. Matthew added a low hum, and from the trees, all 3 shapes answered. Bracken made one last sound, soft, like breath leaving a body. Then he stepped down from the porch. He didn't look back. The forest accepted him. The night wrapped around their silhouettes. And then they were gone. The next morning, Ada stepped outside before the sun had fully risen. Dew clung to the grass, and the birds were just beginning to test the quiet. She almost missed it. There, on the porch, left like a gift, was a woven shape made from river grass, bark strips, and soft moss. Simple, careful. 3 figures, one small between 2 larger, their hands linked. A family. Matthew came out behind her, still groggy. She held it up for him to see. He didn't speak. They didn't need to. That evening, as the last light vanished behind the ridge, Ada sat on the steps and let herself laugh, low and full and unguarded. Somewhere deep in the woods, a whoop answered. Not urgent, not sad, just there. Snow fell the way it always did in late spring along the higher ridges of Payette, the quiet kind, where each flake seemed to hang in the air just long enough to remember. Ada stood on the porch in her old boots and a thicker coat, her breath coming out in thin trails that disappeared before they touched the trees. The sky above was low and gray and full of weight, but the world below it felt still, not heavy, just waiting. Inside the cabin, the kettle clicked once, done boiling. The light in the kitchen glowed soft and yellow against the pine walls. It was the last morning she'd have to brew 3 cups. Matthew leaned against the door frame, still half wrapped in the quilt he'd dragged down from the loft. His face looked older this week, or maybe just more honest. He didn't speak, but Ada could feel him watching her. Bracken sat by the wood stove, long legs folded neatly beneath him, head tilted slightly like he always did when the room was filled with more thought than sound. He hadn't knocked or hummed in over an hour. He didn't need to anymore. The silence between them had turned into something warm, something known. When Ada looked at him, she didn't see the same being she had found slumped against the tree months ago. She didn't even see the Bracken who had saved her son from slipping into the earth. She saw someone whole now, someone preparing to leave. He hadn't said it, not in any way that resembled words, but she could feel it in his pacing, in the way he no longer responded to every laugh, in the way his eyes drifted over and over toward the tree line like the edge of a remembered dream. She turned to Matthew. He's going back. Matthew nodded slowly. Yeah, I know. They didn't try to stop him. Some departures don't need permission. That afternoon, Halden called. He'd been quiet since Ada sent back the recorder and the tapes, wrapped in cloth and sealed without a note. He hadn't called to pry. He hadn't asked what she planned to do with it all. But now his voice was low and careful on the line. "If you care about him," Halden said, "you'll let him leave before they find him." Ada's chest tightened. "There have been questions," he went on. "A ranger spotted tracks, unexplained. I've heard rumors about infrared drones being tested on the forest edge. Someone's looking." She didn't thank him. He didn't need her to. When she hung up, the line between her ribs and her throat burned with something she couldn't name. Bracken had already known. That evening, for the first time, she lit every lantern in the cabin, the kitchen, the living room, even the one she used to keep in the attic, the one Matthew had found rusting and useless. He had cleaned the glass a few nights ago, fixed the wick. Now it cast a glow on the ceiling like a sun rising beneath the floorboards. They ate in silence. Not mourning, not celebration, just presence. When the plates were cleared and the fire burned low, Ada stood from the table and extended her hand. Bracken looked at it, then reached forward and placed his palm over hers. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She stepped toward the center of the room, where the wood planks were worn smooth from years of footsteps, and began to hum. Low, steady. 3 notes followed by a pause. Then again. Matthew joined her, tapping his knuckles gently against the side of his chair, then his chest. Bracken straightened. His head rose, and he answered. Together, the 3 of them filled the cabin with the rhythm of something not quite music, not quite language. Something bigger. A chorus made of wood grain and memory and breath. The kind of thing that carried farther than words ever could. When it ended, there was no applause, no ceremony, just a stillness that curled around them like steam. Bracken walked to the front door. This time he opened it himself. He turned once, eyes soft in the lantern light, then looked at Ada. She gave the smallest nod, and he walked into the snow. There was no howl, no knock, no final song. He stepped off the porch and disappeared between the trees. Not rushed, not hesitant, just homeward. For a long time she stayed standing in the doorway, listening, not for sounds, but for absence, the kind that wraps itself around you when something you love finally goes where it belongs. That night the cabin didn't feel empty, just quieter. That good kind of quiet, like the end of a story told well. Ada couldn't sleep. Around midnight she stepped out onto the porch again, the snow crunching beneath her feet like a whisper. The sky above had cleared. A few stars blinked through the gaps in the clouds. She stood for a while, looking toward the ridge. Then she smiled. Not because of anything, just because she could. She raised her hand, tapped the railing 3 times, then hummed, soft, deep, one long breath drawn from the center of her chest. And the woods answered, faint, low, a single whoop, floating through the trees like a thread of smoke. She let it settle, then said, so quietly she could barely hear herself, "If you can hear me, I hear you too." The words disappeared into the cold, but she knew they were carried. Somewhere deep beneath the roots, in the soil that remembers everything, they would live on. Behind her the cabin glowed. Inside, the old tapes still sat on the shelf. The grass-woven family still rested on the windowsill. The laugh lines around her mouth had returned. So had the rhythm. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't need to. Not every goodbye is the end of a language. Some are just the beginning of a new one. And in the spaces between her laughter and the night's reply, Ada Rollins listened for the beat and smiled. Sometimes the most powerful connections in life don't begin with words. They begin in silence, in glances held a second too long, in rhythms shared without trying, in the warmth of a hand resting nearby, not touching but close enough to say, "You're not alone." And maybe that's all any of us are really searching for in the end. Not grand declarations or flawless answers, just someone or something that chooses to stay, to listen, to meet our laughter with recognition and our fear with stillness, to see the parts of us we've hidden away and gently respond not with judgment, but with presence. There are moments in this world when the lines between language and emotion blur. When the body remembers truths the mind has forgotten. Kindness is one of those truths. So is protection. So is the quiet bravery of choosing love again after loss. These are not traits of one species. They belong to life itself, to anything with a heart that beats and a soul that aches to be understood. And sometimes, in the most unexpected places, deep in the woods or deeper within ourselves, we discover that the ability to understand one another doesn't come from speaking the same language, but from choosing to listen to a language not our own. A rhythm foreign to us. A hum we never knew we remembered. We live in a world where it's easy to feel disconnected. Easy to scroll past someone's pain. Easy to retreat into our own stories and close the door behind us. But stories like this remind us that even the most unlikely beings can share something sacred. That warmth can exist in the wild. That family can form from fragments. That healing doesn't always look like we expect it to, but it always begins when we choose to stay. The forest may hold its secrets, and time may move forward as it always does. But certain moments live beyond both. A shared laugh. A saved life. A silent understanding exchanged in the dim light of a place far from the world's noise. These are the kinds of truths that endure. Not loud, not showy, just quietly, undeniably real. If something in this story found its way into your heart, if it stirred something you didn't expect, or simply reminded you of what still matters in this noisy world, then thank you. Thank you for walking through the snow and silence with us. For listening. We'd love to hear what you felt. Was there a moment that moved you? A truth that lingered? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Just one word, or as many as you need. And if you believe these stories deserve to reach more hearts, consider subscribing to the channel. Your voice helps keep this forest of kindness alive. Until next time, wherever you are, listen for the laughter that answers back. And remember, some goodbyes are really just a new way of saying I'm still here.